Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, this is very echoey. Oh well. Thanks to the Robarts Center, to Jennifer, to all of the public history students that came here. Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here. I'm not a Brit. I am a Canadian. I came, I've been in the UK for about 5 years, and before that I spent a long time in Canada working through a PhD, working through postdoc, and got hired to do a job in the UK. So if anybody wants to talk about doing a master's over there, come and talk to me. So as was said, I'm a lecturer in Britain in a program called Creative and Cultural Industries Management, which is kind of a mouthful, but it's kind of an umbrella term that we use over there. I'm not even sure if we talk about creative industries here. It's an umbrella term that's used to kind of encompass all of those organizations and institutions and companies that work in anything to do with culture. Now, culture is a very big thing in the UK, so we frame culture quite broadly to include those symbolic, expressive, performative, meaning-making aspects of society. And that's the concept that I'm going to sort of not really draw on today, but think about containing my talk about heritage within those ideas about what culture is. So I want to talk about heritage as a cultural phenomenon that fits kind of within this realm of performative meaning making. So I want to think about heritage as the complex of ways in which, and I'm reading, I'm sorry, this is pretty long, so I'm going to whip through this. Hopefully you won't get too bored. I want to think about heritage as the complex of ways in which cultural knowledge and cultural meanings are made through people's relationship with the past. So heritage in this case is not simply a resource or a thing for management, nor is it just a technique for the making public of history. Instead, I want to think about heritage as a sensibility, as a consciousness, as a process of deciding what is important about people's pasts, what has value. So for students here, I'm not necessarily talking about history and the presentation of history in public venues, and I'm also not just talking about those tangible symbols of historic events or important people, forts, museums, those kinds of things. They've kind of come to mean heritage within our society. I want to talk about those intangible processes where people engage with the past as a social phenomenon and as a cultural and media practice. I also want to think about how we validate knowledge about the past. So this is complicated, it's values-laden, it's conflicted, it's a process in the present, very often driven by our desire to speak to the future. It is, as Lowenthal wrote in the article that you read at the very beginning, it is a fantasy. But there's so much more than a dispute over what is said about history. Ultimately, heritage is about values, about how knowledge about history and about the past is signified as important. And that signification depends on who is making the judgment and why they are doing it, and who basically can claim the resources in our society to place that judgment of value in the public sphere. So I need to change here. What we got? Okay. So 2 goals today: to remind people that heritage is a cultural phenomenon. It's not always a resource with intrinsic value, and it's not just an output for historians to make history public. I'm talking about heritage that's a personal, social, and a governmental meaning-making process that involves the past in some way. But my other goal is to explore my personal role as a practitioner and as a researcher who produces knowledge, or maybe better to say, who negotiates knowledge about the past. My own experiences in heritage have involved both presenting the past in public spaces and in devising forms of research that involve ordinary people's subjective stances in relation to the past, so particularly people with minority backgrounds. I try to engage with non-mainstream forms of knowledge making as an integral part of research and of public culture. And by this I mean I've always been involved with cultures that are not my own, and my subject position by the nature of my skin involves acknowledgement of relations of power. Thus, my second goal is to take you on a bit of a personal journey about my engagements with heritage. So I want to start off with this idea, the value of heritage. And the images I frequently use here are from Writing on Stone in Alberta, also known as Assinabi. I was recently a part of a United Kingdom Research Council project called Cultural Value. And this project involved different studies inspecting how we might judge the value of culture in ways that are not just economic or instrumental. How is culture important to people? What part does it play in their lives? Can we measure this value? This research theme wanted to take the idea of culture beyond products or objects, works of art, classical music, museum artifact, into thinking about culture as an embodied activity, as an experience, as a process. And this led to my own reflections on how do we define the value of heritage? How we assign value depends on how we define the concept of heritage. Is heritage things or monuments or events or stories that have an intrinsic importance? Are they forever valuable to society? Is heritage a fantasized version of history, something less valuable because it has little basis in rational fact? So what do we mean by this term? And different disciplines, different societies, different cultures think about heritage, about their uses of the past in different ways. I'm a cultural studies scholar, so the questions that I ask about the past are different than maybe an historian or an artist. My interest is in identity, it's in meaning making, it's in relationships, it's in power. So my take on the word is, the word heritage is affected by all of those things. Instead, I would like us to think of heritage itself as a concept that describes a process of valuation. Heritage as the making valuable of objects, of places, of people, of events, of narratives, of memories, sensibilities that are attached to the past in some way. So the making valuable of these things. Think of heritage in that way. This heritageization, tried to spell it there. There's an S in the UK. I made it a Z for you guys. This heritageization marks things or practices from the past as important. How and why any human culture is deemed valued then becomes a crucial question for research and understanding. So I'm making the point that from my perspective, heritage works in a particular way. So for me, heritage is a process. It's not a thing. It's a social perception, not a historical content. It's something we do to the past. We heritageize, which ascribes value to some aspect of the past. So to get at this question of valuation, I go back to questions of how do we construct knowledge? And this is a basic question of process. When I say how do we construct knowledge, I'm asking how do we as a society and how do we as researchers construct the idea of value? In my research, I look at who is doing the valuation, that is, marking those ideas about the past as important, for what reason, who's actually observing, what do observers bring to this meaning-making processes, visitors? What assumptions do we take for granted in our disciplines and in our practices when we validate certain aspects of the past? And that includes your practices too. What assumptions do we normalize that tell us what gets validated through our publications or our exhibitions? And in this process, we are making a claim of importance or for our use in the present, how the past is useful to us today, And this is a process that makes some of the things about the past valuable, but not all things. And I quote, my quotes here are from Gregory Ashworth and Laura Jane Smith, who are foundational scholars in heritage studies. Ashworth, heritage is the process, not a condition, that uses sites, objects, human traits, etc., as vehicles for the construction of ideas in order to satisfy various contemporary needs. Laura Jane Smith, heritage is a social process which engages with the past in order to understand and engage with the present. So I myself have a complicated understanding of the word heritage, or maybe it's not complicated, maybe I keep trying to simplify it, driven by my own past experiences in places like this, writing on stone, Assinabi. For me, heritage is a relationship with the past, meaningful aspects of our culture that we choose to pass on to future generations. And this implies that there are many ways that people relate to the past as an idea, that how we arrive at meaningfulness and value is multi-layered, it's contested, that we do this at different scales, personal, community, societally, globally. Choosing what to pass on to future generations is an important aspect of this. We think about how we communicate heritage to future people, to our children. Monuments, museums, but also websites, family pictures. These are all oriented to colonizing the future with what we value today. And colonizing the future is an important term. I'm not going to go into it, but think about it. So in the concept of heritage is the idea of inheritance, that we receive some testament or legacy from the past that's our duty to pass on. But again, we can't generalize. What is heritageized as this legacy for the future differs depending on scale, on who is doing the legitimizing and why. So as such, what is heritage is complex and contested. Because of its complexity, we have conflict over meanings. How each of us signify the past leads to disagreement. Laura Jane Smith called the official or the government versions of heritage the authorized heritage discourse. AHD. Stuart Hall called it the heritage, and not everyone agrees. So I want to think about what is heritage today in 4 ways. These can be seen as perspectives or even disciplinary ways of thinking about heritage. Heritage as a thing, heritage as a place, heritage as a process, and heritage as a practice. And while I focus on the third one today, heritage as a process, all have been important to me as a practitioner and as a researcher. And all things contribute to the bigger question of what is heritage. I argue that heritage views as a thing is the predominant way that institutions think about heritage. So heritage is a material something which is collectible, whether it's tangible objects or buildings. The past tends to be objectified, often aestheticized, certainly institutionalized, perhaps as objects, specimen, trophies brought back to museums through colonization. Things are listed as heritage resources, like buildings, quantified to certain standards. These things tend to be validated into national evidence of the history or the heritage of the nation. Heritage perceived as a place often goes together with heritage as thing, but has a more amorphous shape. It might be an entire landscape, like writing on stone, or national parks, places that need our protection and stewardship. Management is a big word here. There's a more ecological approach to what is heritage here. Certainly aesthetics plays a part in its valuation and affective or emotional responses. And I use the word affect a lot. It's kind of a word for emotional. Often this value is seen as intrinsic rather than man-made. While we promote conservation when we see heritage as place, our economic enterprises like tourism depend heavily on heritage perceived as place. The third point, heritage as process. So my interests lie in this area, but the first two can affect and be affected by it. When heritage is seen as a process, as I mentioned earlier, the focus is on how people relate to the past by active doing or making. This process is dynamic, the performance of intangible practices like music or baking or crafts that brings the doer in a relationship with the past. Telling stories about memories or histories in ways that have meaning to us as humans. So heritage making here is embodied, it's emotional, it's relational, it's performative, usually done by amateurs, rather, ordinary people. Heritage as a process means the acts of making and the consciousness that these acts are important to us. We signify value here by doing. And the final way of thinking of heritage that I list here is as a practice. And by this I'm referring to institutional and governmental management of those things, of those places, of those processes. Administrative practices tend to focus on standards, funding, governance, and our own very particular professional practices, the things we do in museums, for instance. In critical heritage studies, we identified this perspective as a dominant concern, as we all in academia and in government departments get caught up in the administration of heritage. And this work itself is elevated as the central value. Gotta get it done, gotta get it done. Questioning the power and politics that privileges these practices is a concern here. This means opening up and decolonizing the professions and their practices to active decision-making by people who have been marginalized. So keep those four perspectives in mind as I now address my second goal here, to take you on a bit of a journey through my personal practices, but also my research. And I want to illustrate how the concept of heritage can be all of these things, and especially how it is inherently, for me, a process of valuation. And I start this journey here at Writing on Stone with the full realization that my immersion in heritage and heritageness as a practice began in a colonial context. And I'll talk a bit about how my subjectivity has evolved, I hope, despite my embeddedness in white perspectives. I start this journey here at Asinabi, where I worked in the 1980s, oh my God, 1980s. That's me with the hat. Writing on Stone is the site of an incredible collection of Indigenous rock art in Alberta, which line the sandstone cliffs along the Milk River in the thousands. Has anybody ever been there? So amazing. Okay, so this landscape and the rock art are sacred to the Blackfoot people, with a long history stretching back as much as 4,000 years, they say, but probably longer. The heritage here is a testimony to the living cultural traditions of the Blackfoot. According to Blackfoot beliefs, spiritual powers inhabit the earth, and the characteristics of the landscape and the rock art at this site have links with those traditions. This year it was listed as a World Heritage Site. And I'm starting at this point because this site holds for me the key to my interest in the emotional making of heritage, affecting both my professional experiences in the field and my research as an academic. It was here that I came to understand heritage as both an embodied activity that connects us in some way to the past, and a structure of feeling, referencing Williams, or a sensibility or consciousness in relation to the past that we elevate in our heads as important. That's heritage, that's heritageization. I began my career here at Writing on Stone, and as I say, that's me in the hat. I worked as an archaeological field assistant at the same time as working as a public interpreter, so guiding visitors that came to see the rock art. So writing on stone is a prime example of heritage that's a thing, a place, a process, and also a practice, certainly was for me. The thingness of it, the actual works of art, and the cliffs that harbor these petroglyphs and pictographs have been physically protected by designation and the creation of a provincial park in 1957. A World Heritage listing came in 2019, this year. But what gives this thing of heritage is its importance, its value, I think, lies in those affective aspects, the relationships, the ongoing practices that coalesce at this site. This is where significant things happened to the ancestors of the Blackfoot. This is where ancient stories took place. So that sense of sacred place that emanates from this spot, both the natural environment and the art left upon the cliff walls, the power of this place is stunning, as you can attest. Landscape in this sense is not a static background, but instead is felt, it's imagined, it's animated through our own embodied and sensory processes. The art here, in many cases, was a representation of a young man's quest, spirit quest, in the distant past. I don't think anybody's doing it now, although, we came close. But the human spiritual practices that went on in this location still happen today. So this cave would have been an absolutely fabulous vision questing site. We went up to the cave and, loved it, and then all of a sudden discovered this painting up on the ceiling. Like, clearly, the ceiling of a cave up at the top. Clearly this was a place of spiritual practices, and there's still practices happening in this cave, thousands of years later. So throughout history, really, at the site, and there's thousands of these images, there's been carvings and there's been recarvings, painting, repainting, and even those acts of physical connectedness with place, with cliffs, with the past. This marking enacted at this spot shows a desire of people to speak to the future. Spirituality is one aspect of what is heritage that is overlooked, and certainly it gets overlooked in public history as well. People of all religions enact practices to express spirituality and connectedness to traditions, ancestor, gods. Such acts have value. They enrich our lives, and I consider this a heritage-making process. So heritage as an affective process of valuation is embodied here in these sensibilities. This does not negate those other aspects of heritage, but complements and enriches them. And for me, this process of heritage making was a core practice enacted through my work as a practitioner. The interpretive activities for the public, we focused on how to impart an intangible sense of heritage using embodied, first-hand, sensory, affective techniques. The primary goal was to raise awareness and appreciation for the heritage of this place. This was consciousness raising as heritage practice. But I was first struck by the differences, though, between this sensibility of heritage as process and institutional ideas about heritage as thing. When I read the archaeological report that came out of the survey and subsequent government reports on valuation, I had spent 3 summers, walking through coulees, avoiding rattlesnakes in the searing heat, trying to map these impressions of art on these amazing sandstone formations. But I was so immensely disappointed when I read these reports that designated the heritage value of this spot. The survey spoke of, numbers of carvings, aesthetic styles, tribes that maybe did them, why these practices went on back then. It talked about the importance to the Blackfoot people as a historical thing, as the past. But lost somewhere was this affective relationship that certainly I felt and built upon. What was kept as the important topic or content of heritage here, what was valued, was not these affective processes and connectedness to the past, but the thingness of it, the thingness of the carvings, which seemed to hollow out what I felt was the significance of this place. But this idea that value only lay in tangible heritage has gradually been eroded, luckily. Local Blackfoot people have been hired to do the interpretive programs, and some people continue to use the site for ceremonial purposes. But the language of heritage has been really slow to change, and archaeological terminology still predominates, as well as sort of historical and archaeological perspectives. The rodeo ground, which was a permanent problem, has yet to be removed. The spiritual nature of Asinabi received a boost with its World Heritage designation, where more intangible attributes, the spiritual power of the place, and the living traditions of the Blackfoot were mentioned, designated, and they were central. So hopefully, the validation of writing on stone as heritage has evolved. Okay, one more thing on this topic. Got a lot more talking to do. I also felt the need to talk here about my subjectivity as an employee and as a researcher in relation to heritage. This sacred place was not part of my ancestry. Yet after 3 seasons, I felt I had an intimate relationship with the environment, with its history, with people's practices here. I felt I shared this heritage and was instrumental, certainly it was instrumental in shaping my feeling of heritage, my ways of thinking, my identity, ways of perceiving. So I always say this, that this was my heritage. Now, if we think of heritage as an affective, embodied sense of the past that shapes our present ways of being, that we want to pass on to future generations, this was my heritage. But what do I do with this subjectivity as a white middle-class academic, my subject and power positions, both within the heritage sector and in my study of heritage? I'm hyper-aware that in this positioning I am intruding on business that's not really directly mine. The authorized production of heritage, which I've been involved with, usually involves a very narrow group of people, 8% of the population in the UK. Those are the people, like me, who produce heritage, official heritage. But I shared the sense of spirituality in this landscape. Since this place made me feel like, what I was, can I say this was my heritage? Can I say this was my heritage? Is there room for an idea of a shared heritage here, where this place can feel important to me and be valued by me, as well as those whose ancestors left those carvings? This is a question I have not resolved, really, and is part of what I mean by heritage as a process, as a convoluted process, depending on who is elevating it as important and why they are doing so. Change of tone here. Okay, so consequently, my subjectivity within my own heritagization practices and research has become a core concern of my academic life. I spent a good 20 years in the heritage field after writing on stone. Finally went back to do a master's degree with a concern about what gets presented as heritage, how it gets presented, and who gets to be involved. And I left the sector concerned that the messages that we were putting out there in mainstream institutions had no heart, had no soul. This heritage valuation lacked consciousness raising, relationship building, those affective processes that I felt were very important to the functioning of heritage as a process in our lives. I did feel that sensibility sometimes in my professional practice. It was always in the processes before an exhibition was installed or before a program or whatever was designed. There could be excitement and inspiration and connectedness, and it all happened behind the scenes. But the instant the exhibition or the program was offered, set in stone or finished, that affective process was gone. So for me, the end product is not where heritage happens. It happens in that conversation, in that negotiation, in that conflict that occurs beforehand when we bring to the table and talk about our ideas about the value of the past, and in the process of making or doing. My pictures for these are not great, but okay. So it was the experience of contributing to a collaborative project on Black history that cemented my research interest in heritage as a process of meaning making and signification. I experienced the intense negotiation of identities and narratives and techniques and politics that went on behind the design of an exhibition on the Underground Railroad in Toronto back in 2002. And this was the first time that Canada's National Historic Site had attempted an exhibit on Black history, 2002, beyond one single commemorative plaque in 1925. So this was a move by government to try and open up public history to underrepresented groups, and an African Canadian consultative group was assembled to work with exhibit planners. And for my research, I chose, and this was my master's, to study the relationships that went on behind the scenes with this committee of African Canadians, mostly amateurs, and white professional staff. I was interested in the heritage making and heritage valuation that was negotiated. The institution had imagined a straightforward public historical commemoration that would show Canada as a liberal nation that welcomed slaves. But for the African Canadians on the committee, the exhibit took on important objectives of achieving respect and active history making by people of color, not as victims, charity cases of benevolent whites. So this was heritageization by both parties, but involving very different uses of the past. I looked at the negotiations around the production of the exhibit. I also studied the exhibit itself as a communicative text, and I researched the audience reactions. And I drew a few conclusions from the study. First, about the importance of the behind-the-scene negotiations. Second, the constructedness of heritage exhibits as a thing or an end product. And thirdly, the dissonance between what the producers wanted and what the audience members actually read. What I want to stress through this example is the idea that this is a process of heritage making. Choices are made about what history to present. This was negotiated, this was constructed. It established meanings and valuation in the public sphere. It was the heritageization of the past. But quite clearly, this exhibit itself was a constructed thing where complexity, so all of those arguments and biases and personal stories behind the scene, became sanitized and celebratory. And I found the audiences picked up on that constructedness of heritage presented there in different ways depending on their age and ethnicity. But just now, what I wanted to talk about is, I think it's really important, or maybe even the most important thing, was the heritage consciousness raising that occurred through the negotiations. So here was a committee of non-experts who were thinking and producing new knowledge for Parks Canada in ways they'd not done so before. So while the exhibit itself was a product hyped by Parks Canada as evidence of inclusive heritage, what seemed important to me was this behind-the-scenes process that drew out and talked about and negotiated ideas about the past. The stimulation of this particular project had a ripple effect among committee members as well as within the African Canadian community. 2 from the committee went on to write books about Black history. Another member developed a traveling exhibit based on this project for smaller communities. So the project seemed to stimulate people to, widen their horizon of interest, undertake research for themselves, articulate for themselves a meaningful connection with the past. So it's about the connection with the past. So my conviction is that a heightened personal involvement with the past, the psychological, social experience of heritage, is a beneficial part of identity building, developing relationships, belonging in the social world, encouraging deep thought, making the world a better place. My subsequent research turned to minority groups themselves, so those people like African Canadians whose narratives did not have a place in mainstream heritage institutions. It was in the process, in the practices generated by ordinary people that for me was the true value of heritage. And so I began to have an emphasis on heritage that has been self-represented or self-expressed through institutions such as this, kind of museum-like forms, heritage exhibitions that maybe serve as community centers, everyday loose spaces where the past can be brought together with the living. My recent work in the United Kingdom looked at memorialization as a practice of valuation. Within memorializing, we value. This was at the Chattery Indian Memorial in Brighton. So it's this striking monument on the Sussex Downs, just north of Brighton. You can see Brighton in the distance, and way past that, the English Channel. The site is both tangible and intangible heritage. It's a unique war monument built in 1921 to honor Indian soldiers who died by the thousands during the First World War. But the Chattery was also, and has also become, a sacred place and a space of cultural processes for the British South Asian community. A place of pilgrimage, an annual memorial service, tea, social mingling. So the Chattery is a public space of heritage, a fixed heritage monument enlivened by ritual and affective practices. The design of the monument and its location on an isolated hill, out of sight of anybody but hikers, you can sort of see it here in the middle, marks this place as unique and experientially different for a war monument. The emotional effect of the memorial and its unique location is a profound sensibility of solemnity and spirituality. And it's in this sensibility that the meaning and value of heritage comes to the fore. So I'm back to spirituality. It's chasing me. So again, for me, as with writing on stone, the landscape provided the framing device within which this sensibility of heritage evolved. The profound effect of place contributes to its valuation as an historic resource and as a space to enact heritage-making practices. I might have enjoyed the lovely outdoor experience emotionally, but I understood that something more was happening at this place, especially through the semi-ritualized, embodied heritage-making practices that went on by people at the site. So valuation was enacted in the ceremony each June that honors the 53 Sikh and Hindu soldiers who were cremated on this spot. The ceremony itself and the resonance that comes from the mixture of people and activities there was striking. There was an amazing atmosphere. An unlikely mixture of people came together and formed a shared sense of community. Strangers, mostly from all walks of life, all colors of the rainbow, but joined in an affective sense of place and of significance. The Lord Mayor of Brighton, the Queen's representative, the local marquis, the Indian High Command, but also people like these, a military biker group in their regalia. This was part of their heritage as well. They came every year and have been for years, as well as the older Sikh guys who served in the Second World War, and one of whom had an uncle who was cremated there. So many, many people came together, and something new was created here, and unexpected. It was non-traditional. It was an experience that depended on and referenced the past, but achieved, value from the heritage-making activities that involved, seeing and being seen, interacting, marking this out as a sense of occasion. There was a formal ceremony, a laying of wreaths, words by many people, so the Sikh host, the holy man, the Queen's representative, but then a haunting hymn sung in Hindi. And then we all massed onto the podium for a huge group shot. So there's 250 people. Everybody came together, and people of all ranks and involvement together. And then the tea afterwards. The crowd makes its way to a local school to eat, look at exhibit panels, socialize, showing pictures. And this is what I would call the best heritage experience. That was clearly a process of enacting some kind of relationship to the past. Oh my God, I've got the same shirt on. Okay. Something new, yes. The experience at the Chattery reaffirmed the importance for me of the emotional, intangible, even spiritual side of heritage. So the passion and excitement, the joy, the playfulness, but also the solemnity and respect that I felt at the event and at the site was a part of life that marked this out with a sense of occasion and importance of valuing. These were ongoing practices that were shaping this fixed piece of old heritage in new ways. And almost everyone in the crowd had really no direct connection to the men who were cremated there, but they built a highly individual sense of significance. Just being there, through the emplacement of their bodies and bearing witness, they participated in this public statement of value. And I'd interpreted these actions not of acts of remembering, but of acts of heritagization. It was not about memories. It was about the making valuable of this moment by their presence. And I also wanted to relate this back to research practices. So the energy and sense of purpose generated through the acts of research, like this focus group, represents for me the real product of my research. As we sat in the room talking about heritage, somebody said, how often do we get 2 hours just to sit down and talk about the past? We talked about our people, and we talk about how we feel about these things. And that was a key moment for me. They went away talking about next steps. You know, what was valuable here was the relationships that were built, the ideas that were shared, the bonds that were made, the facilitating with each other, with other people, an understanding of the world that heritage building is a process that they want to keep going. Okay, I'm almost done here. So this is one way, a cultural studies approach of thinking about heritage research. For me, this is heritage consciousness raising as a research process. My current research project has taken me deeply into that territory in the Multicultural Heritage Project. I've been looking at how heritage is engaged by smaller cultural organizations in the UK that are led by Black and minority ethnic groups outside of the mainstream museums and heritage institutions. So with community partners who have given their time to work on this, and I'm appreciative, we've talked about heritage and its complexity as roots, as identities, as relationships, more so than places. And we've also done a lot of talking about the issues facing minority-led cultural organizations. We had workshops and a national symposium called Whose Heritage?, drawing on Stuart Hall, who I always recommend that everybody read. What came to the fore was their need to challenge the structural barriers behind access and inclusion, as we talked about on a couple of Fridays ago, as practiced in mainstream institutions. The most exciting part of this research, similarly to the Chattery Monument research, has been the intensity involvement from those who were my partners. The project is now winding up. I'm writing academically about their work as border work, as contact zone work. We're collaborating on an edited publication from the conference called Whose Heritage? Critical Challenges, with an assemblage of Black and minority ethnic academics and practitioners writing about heritage making in the UK from their perspective. Another great follow-on has been and is going to be 2 additional funded projects driven by the partners themselves. The planning of a Black cultural organizational archive in the northeast of England, and a policy series of workshops where 4 national heritage organizations like Historic England are coming together with my small organizations in a series of heritage policy discussions around inequalities in the sector. So, just last words to wrap this up. The movement for me has been from a practitioner in heritage and public history, talking about the sensory and emotional side of heritage through the advancing of everyday practices or heritage from below, with heritage seen as a process of meaning making and a practice. And finally today, now a more political interest in inequalities in heritage organizations and society as a whole. Thank you.